You're listening to Word on the Reef, diving into marine science on the Great Barrier Reef and beyond, with Tanya Murphy and Brett Goodban. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Word on the Reef. I'm your host, diver and marine conservationist Tanya Murphy, flying solo again this week as my trusty co-pilot Brett Goodban is away again. But don't despair, he will be back next week. Now, today I'm super excited because we're going to answer some of those burning questions like, how old is the Great Barrier Reef? How was it formed? And how do scientists study the ancient history of a formation like a coral reef, which is A, still alive, and B, tens to thousands of metres underwater? One of our listeners, Nina from Belgium, posed these questions to us a while back via email, and I'm super excited that we've finally found an expert who can answer them. Our guest today is science communicator, publisher, and coral reef biologist and geologist Russell Kelley. Originally from Brisbane, Russell started his career studying fossilised reefs to learn about the ancient history of our marine ecosystems. He then moved to Townsville to pursue his passion for science communication, lecturing at James Cook University and producing several award-winning natural history films and books, including the Be Your Own Guide book series, which is used internationally to train reef surveyors in coral identification. To produce his coral identification books, Russell had to find and photograph every single genus of coral on the planet, a mission which saw him hunting high and low on reefs across the world. Safe to say, he knows his way around a coral. Good morning, Russell. Welcome to Word on the Reef.
Good morning. It's wonderful to be here.
Great to have you on the show. Now, Russell, I'm looking forward to learning about the ancient history of the Great Barrier Reef. But first, let's rewind a bit. You grew up in Brisbane. What was it that sparked your passion for the marine world?
Ooh, well, I like rewinding because it makes me younger. But I grew up in dinghies. I was very fortunate. My father was a carpenter. He built his own dinghies in the 60s. And every weekend we'd dig worms and we'd go catch fish, and Moreton Bay was the place where you could catch unlimited fish at that time. Very different now. But I spent all of this time going around the islands, and he would take me behind some of the islands in Moreton Bay, and he deliberately said, I want to show you something. And he showed me behind Green Island and Santalina Island. He said, look, these are corals. And my father had never owned a face mask or anything, but he told me they were there, and he showed them to me on a nice calm day. And there were all these giant hemispheres that were a particular coral that was very common in Moreton Bay. And eventually I got a snorkel kit. Anyone as old as I am might remember they used to come with little ping pong balls in them. Since deemed dangerous, but they had a little anti-flooding thing which involved
splash-proof ping pong ball. Yeah.
And I eventually got in the water there, and one day while exploring those reefs, with that time I was so young that my dad was still with me, but one day the anchor got stuck and said, oh, don't worry, I'll get the anchor off. And I pulled myself down the anchor line and burst both my eardrums, but I didn't know that I'd done that, like it just hurt a lot. Back then, I didn't even know about equalising your ears when you went underwater. So it was a naive start, but that's where it all started. You know, I fell in love with corals and coral reefs, that there were these strange worlds. And usually when you went to these strange worlds, the fish often had hallucinogenic colours, you know, like parrotfish and strange and wondrous things, which if you had lived in a world where the fish weren't brightly coloured, that was a bit of a shock as well.
Yeah, and I understand that journey took you from going to sea to catch and eat the fish to being more interested in putting them in your home aquarium and studying them. And here we are today. You're a scientist.
Yeah. Well, I joined the Marine Aquarium and Terrarium Society in Brisbane, and I was a legend in my own lunchbox because I could keep corals alive, and that was kind of novel back then. Yeah,
well, even today it's very hard for aquarists to keep corals alive. It's very precise science.
Well, back when I was doing it in the 70s, we didn't have the theoretical framework and all these off-the-shelf things. And my secret sauce is I just went and changed the seawater once a month. And,
the old-fashioned manual technique. Okay.
So just change the ocean. She'll be right.
So Moreton Island and Stradbroke Island and all those islands near Brisbane are obviously much further south and cooler than the Great Barrier Reef, but I have snorkeled there and it's absolutely beautiful, as you say, with abundant life, but that is temperate and subtropical marine life. But you actually studied the ancient history of that ecosystem. So what did it used to be like?
Yeah, well, I went on to do a geology degree and I was really interested in corals and fossil corals, and I sort of naturally drifted into paleontology and stratigraphy, and that's the study of the rocks and the strata that form in the geologic record. And there was evidence just lying around in Brisbane that there had been corals not growing just now, but there was a coral dredging industry, which is what provided all the cement for southeast Queensland. Mm-hmm. And it came from the slightly fossil, or well, they used to call it sub-fossil reefs around Peel and Mud Island and St Helena, and there was an active dredge that worked for 50 years on those islands, just dredging away at a 5 or 6 metre thick seam of these corals that had grown there, as it turned out, in the last few thousand years. And the modern reef lived on top of this sort of sub-fossil reef, because it wasn't fossil in the, often when you think of fossils, it's like the trace of life turned into stone. It's been replaced by minerals and things. Whereas these were, in fact, just corals sitting where they grew until the environment had become less favourable. And corals continued to grow there, but they were different corals that were more resistant to turbid water and the increasing estuarine nature of Moreton Bay over thousands of years.
So it used to be a lot more clear water coral thousands of years ago? Yeah, and now it's more estuarine.
And basically it's all the post-ice age story. So we were in an ice age only 20,000 years ago, and the sea returned from being 100 metres plus lower, and it arrived back to more or less its present level in a great rush and a push, and it covered the continental shelf, flooded what is now Moreton Bay, and at that time it was a vigorously circulating bay. But over the space of a few thousand years after the sea level rise stabilised, it became increasingly estuarine just because of the natural deposition of muds and sands and the growth of mangroves and so on. And so the nature of the environment changed, the nature of those coral communities changed.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty sad to think about all that reef that's been destroyed by that dredging, but you did manage to jump in a dredging pond and collect fossil corals, didn't you? Yeah, well,
a lot of things have changed in the way we relate to Moreton Bay now. It's more of a playground for 1 million people rather than what it was then, which was
a mine site
and extract resources from. And I think it's fair to say that it's greatly valued by the public in every sense now, but it was a different time when I was growing up, and it was more like, well, I got to, just out to get a feed. But anyway, to your story, there was a dredge cut, which was the younger fossil reef, which was about 6,000 to 4,000 years old, and you could literally, where the dredge cut it, it was 5-6 metres thick, and you could go and dive along the wall and see the history of the reef, just one coral after another. But on Stradbroke Island, which was the big sand island to the east, it was one of these high dune islands. There was a mineral sands operation, and it was a dredging operation inside the island, and the mineral sand barge would float along inside this gigantic kind of lake that they built, and it would eat its way through the dunes collecting mineral sands for export. And one day they hit a reef. Corals started coming up through the dredge. And I was the coral guy who was crazy enough to dive in these filthy dredge cuts in the bay, and word got around, and soon I was collecting corals in this It was like diving in custard. Your regulator would blurp and blurp, and there was all these waterlogged trees that you had to get through. It was like a layer of waterlogged trees that you had to get through. Zero light. You had to feel where your bubbles were to even know which way was down.
My goodness.
And it was very buoyant, right? You're diving in custard, and eventually you just swim headfirst into the reef because you couldn't see it coming, and you just grab it and hang on and pluck corals out of what was like a muddy sand clay and put them into a catch bag, and then you'd literally be throwing back to the surface because it was so buoyant. And we did that about 10 times and managed to survive. They wouldn't turn off the dredge, they wouldn't even slow the operation down. We had to do it right next to the dredge. And we went and dated those corals, and everyone was shocked to discover that they were 120,000 years old.
Wow.
And they were species that are now only known from the Great Barrier Reef.
Wow.
They were found now north of Heron Island.
Wow.
And
so very tropical.
And suddenly, corals have been exploiting and using Moreton Bay as a habitat, not just in the present high sea level, but in the high sea level before that.
Before the last ice age, yep.
Yeah, so the two high sea levels, and there's a name for that, interglacials, that's either side of the last ice age, which was the big dip in sea level.
Those are some ancient corals that you quite literally dredged up at great risk to yourself. So, Russell, after your studies in Moreton Bay, you went to start a PhD study on a remote island in northern Papua New Guinea, the Huon Peninsula, where I've just looked it up and discovered that ancient coral reefs are found up to 400 metres above sea level on that island. So right now we are in an interglacial period, which means the sea levels are at a high. How could those corals have possibly got 400 metres above sea level? And what's happening at the Huon Peninsula?
Well, it's arguably one of the great spectacles in the world in that Grand Canyon sense. We're talking geological vista, but it is largely unknown. Yeah,
I had never heard of it until you mentioned it to me, and it sounds like, one of the wonders of the world to see these coral reefs towering above the sea instead of below it.
Yeah, and when I first visited it, which was 1984, my supervisor, who had been there in the 60s, he discovered it when he saw some aerial reconnaissance photos from World War II. And he just wow, what is this place? And he, on a holiday project, he funded his way to New Guinea, and as you did back then, you traded, and he had salt and sugar and beads and things and axes, and he traded his way around that part of New Guinea and walked one end of the coastline to the other where the geology was exposed, and came back and he did his PhD there, and he kind of described the total system. And I later went there to look at the youngest part of that system, and that is an area that is effectively a coral reef that's the same age as the Great Barrier Reef, but bizarrely, it's out of the water. And the reason for that is the north coast of New Guinea, of Papua New Guinea, is actually the geological edge of the Australian plate.
Wow.
And we are colliding and sliding against a different plate that's on the other side. Mm-hmm. And basically it's a geological car crash, and where two plates collide and slide, quite often one of the results of that is either you go under or you go over or you go up. Mm-hmm. And in this case, so what I worked out was that every 1,000 years or so there's one of these utterly devastating earthquakes, sort of like magnitude 7 or 8 earthquake, that lifts the land, just heaves it up, and the reef that was at sea level gets heaved up with it. And if this happens every 1,000 years, how high could this reef be lifted up in 6,000 years? That is the time since the Great Barrier Reef's finished growing. And there is one place on the north coast there where the uplift rate is 4 metres per 1,000 years. And so the Great Barrier Reef that we know today, which is still underwater, in this location, is 24 metres out of the water.
Because the Great Barrier Reef continues up to Papua New Guinea, so it kind of is all connected, isn't it?
Yeah, but as you get around onto the north coast, you hit the crumpling edge of the Australian continent, and it's like a collision zone. And as you know, in New Guinea, there are volcanoes and earthquakes. It's geologically Australia, politically Papua New Guinea, but it's something that you and I don't experience. Maybe once in our life we'll get a little rattle in the cupboard and you'll go, oh, that must have been a tremor. But in Papua New Guinea, you get a rattle every day, basically. Wow. And once every 1,000 years, in this one location, the whole coast heaves up about 4 metres. And so you get this awesome ability, because what then happens is nature takes its course and the rivers and creeks erode down, just like they always have, through that landscape. And they're eroding through the reefs. And as you walk up the rivers and creeks, you can look inside the reef and see every coral that grew after every other coral and their kind of ecological relationships. And sometimes the preservation is so good you can even do species-level ID using the modern taxonomy. Not always, but a lot of the time, yeah.
So you're looking at a layer cake as you walk up these river gullies. You're looking at the wall of the gully and seeing these layers and these corals. That would be absolutely mind-blowing. And you told me that the airport is on top of ancient corals, so they have to move all the corals out of the way to land airplanes.
Yeah, basically it's a series of raised terraces, and each terrace is like a flat bench, and then it's like a staircase, and then you look up beyond that and there's another flat bench, which is the previous reef. So as you go up the hill,
you're going back in time.
Getting older.
Yep.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so I think it's like the third or fourth reef up is 45,000 years ago, and it was a very broad structure. And where it has lagoons, you can't land a plane in that. But where it didn't have a lagoon, you could run a dozer across it and get rid of the biggest bommies and the giant clams and the annoying things that would bang a plane. And it was all seat-of-the-pants stuff, I can tell you that.
Imagine explaining that to the insurance company. Cause of aeroplane damage, boulder coral on the airway.
Well, back then, if you wanted to get a flight out of there, you just went and sat by the airstrip on a Wednesday, and if the plane came, it came, and if it didn't come, you'd have to wait till next Wednesday, right?
Oh, yes.
It's just sort of like,
island time.
What determined it was those little tiny planes, and once they were full of enough cargo, which was usually sacks of rice and pigs and fruit and stuff, if they got too full, they just wouldn't land. You just kind of hoped that you were in luck that day and you could fly out. Otherwise, you had to stay there for another week. And if you didn't have enough food, it got a bit challenging.
I understand that your PhD studies were brought to an abrupt end by a bout of malaria and you had to abandon the place. But that Huon Peninsula sounds like it's home to a huge biological diversity of animals and a diverse range of indigenous communities as well. So it must have been an absolutely incredible place to live for that short time. We could probably do an entire hour just talking stories about that island, but then we wouldn't have time for everything else. But what was one other remarkable experience you had there outside of the fossil reef itself?
Well, I was very fortunate just on one occasion that a bunch of archaeologists turned up, and they had been working in the region, but the geologist, I wasn't the only geologist, there was another guy working there, and a stone axe head had been found. And because it was on top of one of the reefs, we kind of knew its maximum age because the reef was dated. But the axe was draped in a volcanic ash below it and above it, and this human artifact was then dated. So we had 3 dates. We had the reef it sat on, and then the 2 drapes of ash, which were thermoluminescence dated, and they basically came 47, 45, 44,000 years. And this human artifact, the oldest human occupation for Papua New Guinea at that time was 9,000 years. And if you think back to the 70s, Australia, the oldest occupation sites were 20 or 30,000 years. And literally that one site doubled or more than doubled human occupation in Oceania, and that was the sort of discovery that opened the floodgate
Wow.
And very quickly, suddenly, once people realised that the oldest sites in Australia were really just the limit of radiocarbon dating, they were really just dating the oldest the technique could date. And then suddenly we realised, oh, gosh, people had been here much longer. It's just that we weren't able to date accurately their timing.
Yeah, well, it just takes you back in your imagination to some human being and you wonder who they were, and they were maybe going out on their canoe and they dropped their axe head into a coral reef, and they were probably swearing to high heaven because it was their favourite axe head, and they jumped in and tried to look for it, couldn't find it. And then 40,000 years later, there it is, entombed in the layers of the coral reef. It's just the whole story just comes to mind. That's why I find ancient history or this archaeology so interesting, because you can just imagine.
Well, and on top of all that, you have World War II, right? So it's just like there's a wrecked submarine just up the coast lying on its side. There's spiral bombs everywhere, piles of mortars just left lying around in the landscape. No one goes and cleans up after a war. Yeah. And so as a geologist, you really did get to ponder this. You know, it's often the case that the geologists are dealing with rocks that are tens or hundreds of millions of years old. But when you work in the near modern, in the Quaternary, the most recent period, you have to deal with culture and human occupation as well, where it slowly integrates or intercalates with the most recent geology. And it's taking all that stuff to a higher resolution, because most of the deep time geology, you don't have that option. You don't get to see the interesting little intercalations of culture and humanity mixed up with biology and geology.
Now, I want to get talking about the Great Barrier Reef really soon, but first I just have to take a quick detour to Europe. Now, many cities in Europe are built on limestone, and underneath they are riddled with caves. For example, Budapest is famous for its underground cave diving in the limestone rock there. And when I was in Paris a couple of years ago, I went down into the catacombs beneath Paris, which are ancient limestone quarries. And I'm not a geologist, but I'm aware that limestone is a type of rock which forms from sand and marine organisms like coral and shells accumulating on a sea floor. So, Russell, according to geological history, what's going on here? Why is there so much seafloor in Paris and Budapest and throughout Europe?
Well, where to start?
Give us the brief version, because we got to get onto the Great Barrier Reef. But I couldn't help myself just being so curious about how limestone ends up in... I mean, it used to be a big sea, a shallow sea, right?
Yeah, so limestone, the word lime or limey, comes from things that are made of calcium carbonate, which is basically marine animals and plants that form skeletons and contribute that into the sediment. And wherever those skeletons become dominant, the sediments are predominantly made of skeletons of plants and animals, then you end up with a limey rock, a calcium carbonate rock. And over geologic time, that will go from being mainly biological bits, it will kind of be compressed and changed into something that is more of a crystalline rock. But it's still limestone. We call it limestone, and it weathers in a particular way. So I'm sure most people who have been out the back of Cairns or the back of Townsville will see those kind of limestones that have what's called a karst weathering. It's a sort of a strange grey-blue rilled look to it, and the rock is very sharp and sometimes very difficult to walk on, because it's basically limestone is soft and it's easily weathered by anything like water, and particularly water with organic compounds that make it a little bit acid. That gives you a really distinctive weathering. So wherever you go in the world, if you see this kind of blue-grey rock and it's got fossils or what looks like the echoes of animals in it, and it's got this rilled karstic sort of weathering on it, that's limestone. And it's basically saying the sea was here. And it could be a very deep ocean type environment, because out in the deepest ocean you've got this perpetual planktonic rain of little calcareous organisms that ultimately by plate tectonics get reworked and pushed up onto the land as a limestone. But it could also be somewhere like on a continental shelf like the Great Barrier Reef, it grows and is dominated by things that have calcareous skeletons like corals, bivalves, chinoderms, all those funny things that make skeletons. They all end up in some kind of fossil reef structure at the hand of plate tectonics and geology. Mm-hmm. And so the story in Europe is as ancient as you want to go. You keep going back further, you'll keep finding limestones. But the limestone I think you want to sort of talk to is the ones that are on the shores of the Mediterranean and those North African countries, Turkey, Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, the Morocco, these places, and France and even England. Those countries are today the ancient shorelines of a now dying or dead ocean. So if you sort of look at the Mediterranean, imagine it was wider and longer and that Africa was a lot further south. Basically, what you're doing is you unwind that story. What you get is an ancient ocean called the Tethys Sea. And that Tethys Sea was a big pan-tropical ocean of 100 million years ago until fairly recently. And Africa is closing off the last gasps of that ocean to give what we have in the Mediterranean. But at that time, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 million years ago, this was, at times, the coral triangle of its time. And there were very tropical, reef-dominated communities. And so on the shores of the now dead Tethys Sea, we have the fossil reefs of tens of millions of years ago, and they are the ancestral reefs of the modern corals that we know out in the Indo-Pacific, the Coral Triangle, Great Barrier Reef, and Indonesia to the north. All those corals had their origins in this ancient ocean, and they dispersed out of there to get out of the road of the geologic crushing of this ocean by plate tectonics.
Yeah, Africa's been moving north and making the Mediterranean Sea smaller is what I'm taking from that. And so the coral species moved elsewhere and ended up at the Great Barrier Reef, which is the moment that everyone's been waiting for.
Yeah, and Australia has been drifting north, and Australia has the same story. There was a time when we weren't tropical and we were drifting through temperate and subtropical seas, and we have been arriving in the tropics. And I think I mentioned, New Guinea is the crumpling edge of Australia. We're colliding with Asia and the other plates in the Asian region. We're colliding with Indonesia. And the reason there's a gigantic mountain range called the Owen Stanleys in Papua New Guinea is because that is a collision zone. It's a car crash between these two plates, and those mountains are going up at a fantastic rate. And so prior to that, Australia was further south, and we didn't have a Great Barrier Reef or even a reef community back then, 40 million years ago. That's only kind of turned on in the last 20 million years, and in particular the last 10.
Wow. Okay, so that brings us to the moment that everyone's been waiting for. How old is the Great Barrier Reef, and how did it form?
Well, it depends. So you'll never get a straight answer out of the geologist because there's no edges to my box, right? It's just that coral's just been moving around from one area to another, I suppose. So where do you draw the line? It helps if you sort of constrain it, I suppose, and sort of say, like, if you go to the ribbon reefs, how old is the reef there? Right? Or if you're talking about the Great Barrier Reef as we kind of know it today, places where you can see corals, well, I can tell you that what we do know, because of the science that was done in the 80s and 90s and even earlier, shallow drill holes were drilled through the reef, not sort of oil industry drilling. These are tiny little scientific drill cores, and they basically give you a pinhole of light. So you pull a limestone core about 5 centimetres wide out of the fabric and structure of a reef, and then you map it and look at it very carefully, and every time, in every single core, what they saw was a reef fabric, so limestone, that gave way to a period, a sort of usually only a few tens of centimetres of what looked like a soil, and below that, another reef fabric, but it was much older. So if you use radiocarbon dating to date the limestone, because you can do that, limestone corals in particular are good for dating, what we found was that the earliest kind of reef dates above that soil was about 9,000 years. And typically the youngest dates, where right at the top of the core, were sort of maybe 4,000 years, roughly.
Mm-hmm.
And if you went below the soil and tried to date it, you couldn't use radiocarbon because it was clearly older than the limit of radiocarbon dating. So they would switch to a different isotope, to uranium series dating, and lo and behold, universally you get 120,000 years for anything that's below the soil.
Wow.
And what we're looking at there is 2 episodes of high sea level. So I think if we think back to the Moreton Bay story we were telling, there was a time 120,000 years ago when the sea level was very high and interglacial. And then we went back into an ice age and the sea level fell by 130 metres. Only 20,000 years ago, we were at the maximum of the ice age, and Europe's covered with ice sheets 50 metres thick. North America's covered in ice sheets. There are glaciers everywhere. People are in survival mode. And then literally 9,000 years later, we have the coral reefs growing in shallow water on the Great Barrier Reef. So it is a layer cake. You have an older layer of an earlier version of the Great Barrier Reef, which grew when the sea level was last high, and then the seas retreated off the continental shelf to somewhere down the slope, about 130 metres is the usual estimate. And then coming out of that ice age, the seas get up to the edge of the shelf, and you think of the ribbon reefs and those channels between the ribbons.
Mm-hmm.
They were the river valleys of the rivers that were flowing across the continental shelf during those ice age times.
Mm-hmm.
Indigenous people were living there. They were probably, because people like to live in caves, they were probably living in caves that formed in that limestone, which would have been like a fantastic view.
Wow.
You climb up to your limestone hill and have a nice place to live and have a fire, and you could look down on the floodplain where these rivers were flowing out through the reef passes that we know today, and they probably to some degree even cascaded down that steep slope on the outer barrier.
Wow.
So it was a very different time, and then the sea level came back and it just sort of got over the edge of what is the outer shelf now about 9,000 years ago. These are rough figures because the bathymetry changes from north to south, and southern Great Barrier Reef is different from the northern, but crudely, about 9,000 years ago, the sea creeps up through those ribbon reef passes and then floods onto the continental shelf, and the ribbon reefs become islands. And that low, flat continental shelf would then have become wetlands and mangrove forests and what you would describe as probably fat country, lots of food in this shallow gradient where the sea and the rivers are sort of tangling together and having to deal with the fact that there's no gradient to run away down that slope anymore. So now we're forming wetlands and complex meandering ecologies. And it wasn't until that sea level rises another 10 or 20 metres and forces the shoreline back to where we are today that on the outer edge you'll have conditions that are clear and clean enough for corals to settle again. And what are they going to settle on? They're going to settle on the ancestral Great Barrier Reef. Mm-hmm. They're just coming home. Hi, Mum, I'm home after 120,000
Great grandmum. Yeah. So, wow, that's so fascinating. It's like a layer cake. So you drill down, you can see the very ancient reef, which is 120,000 years ago when the sea levels were high and there was a reef there. And then there's soil on top from when the sea levels receded during the Ice Age, and people lived there and there was land there and trees and kangaroos and everything. And then above the soil level, the sea levels rose again at the end of the Ice Age, and then corals grew on top again. So that layer cake image is a really good way of describing. So the current Great Barrier Reef after that layer of soil was deposited is, what did you say, 6,000 to 9,000 years old, but it was there in a different form before.
These numbers are a little bit rubbery just because if you go to the Swains down the southern end of the GBR, the outer edge of the shelf is 300 kilometres offshore and the shelf depths get to 100 metres. Mm. or 80, 90 metres. You get up to the northern GBR, the shelf width is 30 kilometres and the maximum depth at the edge of the shelf is 30. So
it's different everywhere.
Can understand. Yeah, so those numbers are kind of rubbery depending on where, you imagine the sea would have been coming in from the south and flooding up from Mackay up towards the central GBR would have been like an arm of ocean travelling on the inside, trying to flank around what was coming through the ribbons and that reef maze that we tend to know in the northern section.
You've painted such a vivid picture. It's amazing, like I was saying, how you can take a core and see a layer cake of geology, and then now you've got this entire story of human habitation, of the land, of the sea. It's absolutely fascinating story. And speaking of the human habitation, we know First Nations people have been in Australia for tens of thousands of years, and when we were in that ice age and the sea levels were significantly lower, they have stories in their oral history about when they used to live and hunt on those areas of the seabed which are now submerged, as you were mentioning. So then that opens up the fascinating possibility of finding artefacts of Indigenous Australians in the ocean. Have you had any cases of that?
No, because I was a reef geologist in an earlier life, and these days I'm a publisher and a trainer. But I follow that literature quite closely because everyone knows that someone's going to find it one day. And there's a team in Western Australia. I know one of the people, a guy called Peter Veth. I think you should have him on the show sometime because he was based in Townsville for quite a long time. But they just hypothesized that we've got to be able to find these things. And they started diving and looking at shoreline ecosystems where there was rocky ledges and things. And they eventually found stone tools. And please don't quote me, I don't remember the exact dates and depths, but in moderately shallow water of like 5 to 10 metres in what might have been occupation sites in these drowned ledges, there they found artefacts and stone tools. And really it shouldn't be a surprise. Like people live on the coast, they like rivers, they like coasts, it's where the food is, where the water is. And if only one day we were lucky enough, we might find an occupation cave on the front of the ribbon reefs. But you could imagine that those occupation caves have had the sea level pass through them and every cyclone, in the last 10,000 years. So there's a fair chance that the evidence is pretty thin. But one day.
Yeah. I just want to encourage the listeners as well to look at the ribbon reefs of the Great Barrier Reef on Google Maps, because you can actually see what looks like canyons or rivers between the reefs. And so it is actually really clear from those satellite images that it used to be coastal river and canyon systems, which then had corals growing on top of them. It's absolutely fascinating. Traces of ancient history. For the last couple of weeks on The Word on the Reef, we've been talking about climate change, which is an unnatural phenomenon caused by humans burning fossil fuels. It's melting the ice caps, and that's causing unnatural sea level rise. So from everything you've told us so far, Russell, it's clear that the sea level has been changing and tectonic plate movements and earthquakes have been pushing land higher and lower throughout the ages due to natural causes. So why is the sea level rise that we're seeing now such a concern?
So the problem is that, yes, natural systems have mechanisms to survive long-term geologic climate change, but they are often very stressed by the rapid pace of anthropogenic climate change. That is the sort of stuff that we're seeing in this last century. So we need to make a distinction between the geologic-driven climate change, which happens with natural cycles. The ice ages are driven by little wobbles in the Earth's orbit. That means the amount of sunlight coming into the planet varies over tens of thousands of years. That's what drives ice ages. But anthropogenic climate change is what you do when you put a blanket over the Earth, which is the atmosphere, and you light fires in it for 250 years. And you refuse to stop burning stuff in that blanket. And what we know from basic physics is the atmosphere is a greenhouse, and we are just burning and causing heat to be trapped inside that blanket. And every indicator from when plants flower, when they fruit, recorded by monks for centuries, along with every instrumental record, just shows that there is a warming trend. And that warming trend is faster than what a lot of natural systems have evolved with. So the problem is that, yes, natural systems have mechanisms to survive long-term geologic climate change, but they are often very stressed by the rapid pace of anthropogenic climate change. That is the sort of stuff that we're seeing in this last century.
It's true that the warming we're seeing now because of humans burning fossil fuels is much more rapid than would have happened naturally in the past. But I understand that the sea level rise when the last ice age ended was quite fast. So if the warming back then was slower, why was the sea level rise so sudden?
Basically, what happens when you're in the cold phase, all this ice builds up at the poles and on the ice sheets on the continents. But when the sort of orbital wobbles in the Earth's orbit favour more sunlight getting into the atmosphere, you go towards a warming trend. Warm currents start to get in at the base of these ice sheets, and when they kind of collapse, they really let go. And so the melting of ice sheets on the continents, and particularly where the ice sheets abut an ocean, what you have is moments where the ice just lets go, and there's something called Heinrich events. So what happens is enormous amounts of ice starts to slough off from the ice sheets and the poles, and that then gets redistributed and melted, and suddenly sea levels rise.
So that's a bit scary with the warming that we're causing now. It's much faster, and sea levels have risen to the point where they're about 20 centimetres higher than 150 years ago. It's a bit scary because we might be coming up to a threshold where ice sheets will collapse and we might see sudden rapid sea level rise, like you described.
So maybe not the most extreme as we know from the Ice Age records, but certainly it would not be beyond the realm of possibility that, we're talking half a metre rise in 50 years or more. And this is the sort of thing that scares the pants off climate and oceanographic scientists because, again, as you would know, the ocean is 70% of the planet, and the CO2 blanket that is the atmosphere every day is just transferring heat into this ocean. And that's what saved us to some degree from seeing some of these impacts sooner, is that heat is going into this gigantic battery called the ocean, and it's going to come back and bite us. So we have to take our foot off the carbon accelerator. Otherwise, you will not enjoy living in the second half of this century.
Yep, it's an important warning. Now, you've been diving throughout the world for decades now. So what changes have you personally witnessed from climate change and things like coral bleaching?
I think having seen bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef 4 times, and then recently seen it all across Indonesia, from Bali all the way through to West Papua and then back up to the Moluccas and the Halmahera Island group, you could just see that in the previous summer, so much of the magnificent coral colonies were just recently dead. And sometimes it's very local. Some places are warmer, like little bays and bayments against the coast. Hot water will pool up against the coast more so than out at the barrier or the mid-shelf. And so you often get bleaching centered on areas where the heat can build up. And I've now seen that at the equator. I've seen that up and down the Great Barrier Reef, and I've seen it in the West Pacific. And I've heard about it from friends and colleagues and in the press everywhere, like recently, even in the Red Sea. So when I reflect on my first experiences of the Great Barrier Reef in the mid-'80s, it's a generally less interesting place than it once was. And by that, what I mean is it often has high coral cover because corals recover quite quickly. But what is recovering is a different system. And if you think about, let's say you go into a forest or any patch of forest and you chop down a whole bunch of trees, what happens in the next wet season is like there's weeds everywhere. And for 10 years or for 5 years, there's weeds, and then a few saplings come up through the weeds, and then 20 years later, those saplings are slowly becoming trees, and they shade out the weeds, and give it 50 years, and there's a tall regenerative forest there. That's ecological succession. And that happens on coral reefs. And on the Great Barrier Reef, what we see after a bleaching event, or crown of thorns and other things, you get a rapid regrowth of the very pretty, fast-growing, what scientists would call opportunistic species. And what we're really saying is weeds. And so this is great from the point of view of the casual snorkeler or diver, great for tourism, because very quickly, like within 3 to 5 years, you have almost 100% cover in less than 10 meters water usually of fast-growing pink, green, blue, pretty things. So you'll hear 5 years or 3 years after a big bleaching event, people will say, oh, the reef's great, it's better than ever. But it ain't what it used to be, and it's not the way I remember it from the 80s, where I just would say the dives were a bit more interesting. They were a bit more three-dimensional. They had more of the trees and old busted trees and, mixed up with all the pretty brightly coloured, fast-growing weeds, if that makes sense, And that's what's different. It's a system that is slowly being dominated by weeds in the upper 15 metres.
Yeah.
And quite often, I think the press has such a shallow understanding of reef ecology that they will never stop the story, so to speak, that the reef's back and it's looking great. No one wants to hear but.
Yeah, well, it's that shifting baseline where it still looks so beautiful that especially people who haven't been there before, I always strongly encourage everyone to come and check it out because it's just so beautiful still. But of course, it's different to
and
what it was.
The shifting baseline is the most important ecological concept that we should be trying to communicate to young people and, well, everyone, because it explains that kind of, old man yelling at the clouds, it's not as good as it was in my day, but it's obvious and it makes sense that the younger people coming through the system, they see what they see and they find it's amazing. And then old buggers like me die. And
nobody remembers
what
it used to be like.
Yeah, that's right. The whole thing shifts, And so another brilliant example of this would be, fishing in Moreton Bay. I grew up in Moreton Bay, and every weekend I'd go out with my dad when I was 10 years old, and we'd go and catch 200 or 300 whiting, and we'd spend all afternoon and evening filleting them, and we'd give plates of fillets to all the aunties in the family. And that was just something I did every weekend for a decade. But slowly you could sort of see it got harder and harder, and we had to have a bigger boat and a larger motor, and we used to catch less. But now people have satellite navigation and 2 outboards instead of 1 and sonar fish finders, and they come home with a few scrawny fish and they think they're doing really well. We used to row out. And my father told me a story that when his father took him fishing, and we're getting back to the early part of the 20th century, they would row out in a dinghy and they'd take the oars and stand them up at either end of the boat. They had a fitting that let them stand the oars up, and they'd tie a rope between them and then lay a blanket over the rope. And then they would quickly light 2 kerosene lanterns and hang it up on each of the oars and then lie in the bottom of the boat. Because if you didn't lie in the bottom of the boat, you'd very quickly get hit in the head by a gigantic mullet, right? And what they'd do is they'd lie in the bottom of the boat for half an hour, and these mullet would see the light, and they were talking great big sea mullet, 2 kilos each, and they would just jump at the lights, hit the blanket and fall into the boat. Wow. And that's how That's how he went fishing when he was a kid in Moreton Bay.
Wow. The fish were so plentiful, they literally just used to jump into the boat. They jumped onto your dinner plate. They jumped onto your barbecue. Wow.
Yeah. And I did it myself when I was a kid. We ran out of bait, and routinely you just tear up someone's, if someone had a white singlet on, you just get a knife and cut it up into strips and throw that out on gang hooks and catch tailor. That was just what you did when you ran out of bait.
Wow. So we really are seeing a lot of change over the recent decades. Now, I've dealt with a lot of comments saying ice ages and warming has always happened, it's natural, and according to what we've learned from you, that is true. But that's why I want to spend so much time, delineating all the differences. And I think 130 metre sea level rise at the end of the last ice age probably was pretty devastating for the Aboriginal people, for example, that had to relocate. But they were such low population numbers and able to pick up what possessions they had and move. Whereas nowadays, most of our largest cities are on the coast and billions of people live on the coast, and they can't just pick up their homes and move. So we're seeing a lot of people suffering extreme devastation to their homes and crops and all those things that we rely on in modern society, which we can't just get up and move because the population is much larger. So we can't just follow the kangaroos inland and continue living off those. So I think there's so many reasons why any degree of climate change or sea level rise now is going to be a much bigger problem than it was in the past. And then, of course, what's different about our current anthropogenic climate change is that we're pumping so much pollution into the atmosphere, which is also causing ocean acidification and, of course, the coral bleaching at the rates that the coral is not adapted for. And Russell, you were mentioning to me that animals can't just move and go somewhere else anymore because we've cornered them into small nature reserves and national parks. And if they wanted to migrate somewhere else, they wouldn't be able to because there's too many roads and cities and farms in the way.
Yeah, well, we have networks of things like national parks, but they've sort of by default also become little jails for endangered or threatened species. And the wet tropics is a textbook example of things where a mountain that can't be turned into a cane field, is declared a national park back in the old Joe days. And what's happening in this warming, what we're seeing is things that like to live in uplands and in cool climates or cooler climates in the tropics. Those birds, those mammals, they are slowly having to climb up the mountain, and eventually they end up extinct they have nowhere else to go. They can't go wandering down through the cane fields and through hundreds of kilometres of urbanity and whatever to then find another mountain and go up. So if the temperature increases, they just go off the top of the mountain. So those things, they're local extinctions. And if you look at it just from a human perspective, eventually, if we keep turning up the heat, we will one day just find that life is not going to be as good as it used to be. And our standard of living, which I think a lot of people are already concerned about, will decrease. And the young people growing up today will not inherit the standard of living that I've been very, very fortunate to have.
Yeah.
And it's like, do you want to spend half of your life living in an air-conditioned box because you just can't be bothered to go outside because it's so stinking hot all the time? Is that the kind of world you want to live in?
Yeah, the really good analogy is that if your home is on fire because of natural geological causes, then you might just have to accept it. But we are burning down our own house. So that is just madness. So we need to stop pouring fossil fuels on the fire. We've talked a lot about the deep geological history and how the sea levels and the climate have changed over millions of years. But we're not going to be around here for millions of years. We need to take action on what we have right now if we want to have a good future for ourselves and our children. So what would you recommend people do to take action on climate change to protect the Great Barrier Reef and everything else as well?
Listen to the science. Take some time. If you're hearing people from our scientific institutes and respected voices in the scientific community, I don't think they really should be put in the same barrel as someone's opinion on Facebook.
Bill from the pub.
And yeah. So if you want to do something, I would say vote one for anybody who wants to do something about taking our foot off that climate accelerator. I would just say think about others and think about the next generation. Take your foot off the accelerator and don't give credence to people who are not coming from a globally accepted scientific position.
Listen to science podcasts. That's my advice. Well, we'll have to get you back for a future episode to tell us more about your acclaimed coral identification courses and books. You've had a long and illustrious career, so of course it was going to take more than one episode to get through it all. But yes, I'll just remind everyone that Russell has written some amazing books if you are interested in learning how to identify almost any coral to the genus level. Check it out at byoguides.com. And you can find out more about Russell's stuff at russellkelley.info. So sadly, that's all we have time for today. Russell Kelley, science communicator, publisher, and coral reef biologist and geologist, and author of the Be Your Own Guide Coral Identification book series. Thanks for all your amazing work, and thanks so much for joining us on Word on the Reef today.
Thank you, Tanya. I had a blast. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And I look forward to round 2.
Awesome. We'll see you in the new year for that. And thanks to all our listeners for joining us on Word on the Reef. I'm Tanya Murphy, and we'll be back on Cairns FM 89.1 next Friday at 10 a.m. with more awesome marine science adventures. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at instagram.com/Word on the Reef podcast. That's all for this week. Best fishes. See you next time.